Okay, it's time for one of my all-time favorite punching bags. But before we get to today's video, there's a few things I want to say about today's video. First of all, shout out to my boy, Huffer Billy Paw, over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. He's the one that put in a request for the South Carolina Gamecocks. And he's a Tater man. That's right, Huffer Billy Paw is a Clemson fan, so he likes clowning the Gamecocks just as much as I do. So we're going to take a look at the Gamecocks 2022 season. Today I'll give you a preview or a brief breakdown of the team, offense and defense, that kind of thing. And then I'm going to put this coming year's schedule up on the screen. I'm going to go through it game by game. I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single game. Good morning, it's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right, it's me, Uncle Lou. And I'm live for you on LouTube today. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also, and in addition to that as well, hey, subscribe to this channel if you're not already. I post college football videos every single day of the year, year-round. There is no off-season here. There's just a part of the season where we don't have any games, and that part of the season is quickly coming to an end here. Less than 2 months away from the start of the 2022 season, and I'm in full swing here with these preview and prediction videos. I think I've done 5 or 6 already. I'm going to continue to do them throughout the month of July and into August. I hope to get about 50 teams done before it's time to start focusing on the actual season itself. As far as which teams I'm doing, well, like I said, I get all these teams from the Patreon page. So there's a link in the description of this video that you can click. It'll take you over to the Patreon page, and you can look around. If you're on the Patreon page, make sure you go over there, find the most recent post where it talks about the prediction videos, and leave a comment letting me know what team it is you want me to do, because that's where I'm getting these teams from. Every day when I get ready to sit down and do one of these videos, first thing I do, head to the Patreon page, scroll through, and pick a team off of there. So that's where I get them all from. So big shout out to everybody over on the Patreon page. You guys are a huge help and a big support here with what I do on this channel. I would not be able to do this full-time year-round if it weren't for the Patreon page. So huge shout out to all of you over there. Now, last thing before we get to the video, I've been saying something about South Carolina all off season, that I think South Carolina is going to be better in 2022 than they were in 2021. After sitting down today and looking over some things about South Carolina's roster, what they lost, what they brought in, the schedule, those kinds of things, I still feel the same way. I think South Carolina is going to be a better team in 2022 than they were in 2021. Another thing I always said at the end of that, though, for the last 3 or 4 months, yeah, I think they're going to be a better team. They might have a worse record. If you look back to last year, they were 6-6 in the regular season, I think, 7-6 after a bowl win over North Carolina. I think they're better, just generally speaking. I think they're better than a 6-win team. However, their schedule this year, which you'll see in just a minute when I put it up on the screen, is just absolutely brutal. Not just who they're playing, but the road games are tough. They've got several places on the schedule where they play back-to-back road games. Their bye week, which usually, you have an advantage in a bye week in that you get 2 weeks to prepare for your next opponent. You'll see when I put the schedule up, the opponent they play after the bye week also has a bye week before that game, which kind of negates that advantage that South Carolina would have in the bye week. So anyway, I do think South Carolina is going to be a better team overall. I think the stats will be better. We'll go over some of that in a little bit, but their record may end up being about the same, or maybe even a little bit worse. It's just a brutal, it's just a brutal schedule. If you look at last year, they were projected to win 3 or 4 games. They won 7, like I mentioned, after the bowl win. But they did get blown out 4 times. They almost lost to Vandy. It was a come-from-behind 1-point win that they had over Vandy last year. So there was some good and some bad last year. It was a mixed bag with Beamer's first season. Let's take a look at their offense for this year. Is it going to be improved? Is it going to be worse? Where do they need to improve? Well, you got to start with quarterback Spencer Rattler, right? Regardless of what you think about Spencer Rattler and how he played last year for Oklahoma, or his attitude or his personality, which has been a big talking point amongst people for a while, going back to his times on the TV show QB1 or whatever it was. He was a little cocky and arrogant. Sometimes a change of scenery is good. The best thing a person can do sometimes is take themselves out of one place and put themselves in another. And that's what Spencer Rattler has done by transferring from Oklahoma to South Carolina. And like I said, no matter what you think about him, he's the highest rated player South Carolina's ever had. If you look at South Carolina's quarterback situation last year, you really couldn't If you sat down and spent an hour trying to come up with a worse quarterback situation than what Carolina had last year, you'd have a hard time doing it. They played 4 different quarterbacks, started 4 different quarterbacks last year, including a kid that wasn't even on the team 4 weeks before the season started. He was a grad assistant standing on the sideline holding a clipboard. They had some injuries to the quarterback position. This particular grad assistant had a year of eligibility left. They strapped a helmet on this kid, and he became the starting quarterback. It was a disaster at the quarterback position last year. So, again, whatever you think about Spencer Rattler, South Carolina is 1,000 times better off at the quarterback position heading into this season than they were heading into last season. That's a huge benefit, a huge positive, a huge step forward for South Carolina at the quarterback position. Offensive line, good news and bad news. Good news, you return all 5 starters from last year's offensive line. Bad news, one of the worst offensive lines in America. It was absolutely horrible. South Carolina could not run the ball to save their life, and they gave up 31 sacks. It's just horrendous. So it's good that you have those guys back. They've got experience. They've been through a season or more, depending on which one you're talking about there. But if they don't get a whole lot better, it may not matter how mobile or how good or how strong of an arm Spencer Rattler has. That offensive line is going to have to get a whole lot better. They got to keep Spencer Rattler on his feet, and they've got to open up some running lanes for the running backs. If you go back 2 seasons ago to 2020, South Carolina running back Kevin Harris led the league in rushing. You could make the argument he was the best running back in the SEC in 2020. Last year, the guy couldn't gain a yard if his life depended on it. South Carolina only rushed for over 100 yards total as a team 6 times. 6 times last year. That offensive line was absolutely horrendous. It's got to get a whole lot better from last year to this year, or really nothing else offensively is going to matter. Now, Kevin Harris is gone. Marshawn Lloyd is back, so that's good. He tore his ACL a couple of years ago. He did play last year, but you know how that goes. The first year you come back from an ACL, sometimes you're still sort of working yourself up to speed. So he should be back to or very close to 100% this year. And South Carolina expected a lot out of him when they signed him. They also bring a transfer running back in from Wake Forest to help out in the backfield. So, again, though, when it comes to the running game, to me, it's all dependent upon the offensive line. You can put Bo Jackson back there. If the line can't block, it's just not going to go well. Wide receiver and tight end position, Josh Vann, the star, of course, at wide receiver. He should have a really good year catching the ball from Spencer Rattler if the line can protect him. And at tight end, they bring the guy in from Oklahoma, and their tight end from last year is back too, who didn't have a great season overall, but he did kind of come on towards the end of the year. In fact, I think he had 2 touchdowns in the bowl game. So tight end could be a strong suit for South Carolina this year offensively. But I think the key, as much as people are focusing on Spencer Rattler, and I get it, very highly rated player, like I said, the highest rated player South Carolina's ever had. So I get the excitement and the hype around Spencer Rattler. The biggest concern or question mark or however you want to put it to me when it comes to South Carolina's offense is going to be that offensive line. Now, we switch over to the defensive side of the ball. I'm much more confident about South Carolina defensively than I am offensively. I love South Carolina's defensive line. Now, that being said, they didn't play that great last year. Didn't play that great. Oh, let me throw one more thing in offensively last year. I had to write this down to make sure I didn't forget it, to make sure I got it right. In the SEC last year, South Carolina, there's 14 teams in the SEC. This is how bad South Carolina was last year offensively. This is why I think they're going to be a better team this year, because I can't see the offense being this bad again. They were 13th out of 14 teams in the SEC in passing yards. They were 11th out of 14 teams in the SEC in rushing yards and 13th in scoring. They were in the bottom 4 of the 3 primary offensive categories: pass yards, rush yards, and points scored. Bottom 3 or 4 in every single major offensive category. I don't see any way possible that doesn't improve. Spencer Rattler, I like Josh Vann. You have to assume the offensive line is going to improve some. The question is how much. It needs to get a lot better. We'll see if it does. But let's switch over to the defense. I really like South Carolina's defensive front. They got some guys over there. They have to play better, like I mentioned, overall than they did last year. But you look at last year's South Carolina defense, I believe they had the number 1 pass defense in the SEC. In fact, I know they had the number 1 pass defense in the SEC. Now, some of that is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. South Carolina's run defense was so bad last year that a lot of teams just chose to not really even attempt to throw the ball on South Carolina. They just pounded South Carolina into submissions. So while the total yardage given up was very good for South Carolina's defense last year in terms of pass yards, some of that can be contributed to the fact that the rush defense really was that bad. Another positive for South Carolina's defense last year, they led the league in takeaways, 24. If you combine interceptions and fumbles recovered, 24 takeaways, which was good for first in the SEC. They returned most of their interior defensive line and most of their linebackers. They do lose some stuff on the back end, but Cam Smith is back, who I think is one of the best defensive backs in the SEC. Maybe not the best, maybe not top 2 or top 3, but he's top 5. You'd be hard-pressed to find 5 corners in the SEC better than Cam Smith. I think he's an NFL player for sure. He returns. He'll be the anchor of that secondary this year. When it comes to the front 7, a couple of linebackers, Birch, who I really like, again, didn't have a great year last year, but ready to break out this year. At least that's what South Carolina fans are hoping and what they need to happen. And is it Strachan? I don't know how to pronounce his name, Strachan. Those are the 2 guys South Carolina needs to sort of pressure the quarterback. These need to be the sack guys. And then when you look at stopping the run on the interior of that line, of course, you've got Zach Pickens, who's a guy that Georgia went after, and you've got Sandridge, who's a guy that Georgia went after. So these are 2 guys that came in under Will Muschamp, right? And say what you want about Will Muschamp, the guy is a defensive genius, and there were high school defensive players, highly rated defensive players in high school, who chose to go play for Will Muschamp for that reason. So South Carolina's got some talent on the defensive side of the ball, particularly, in my opinion, in the interior of that line. They need to play better overall as a unit. Like I said, they didn't play great last year, especially against the run, so they got to get better, but the talent is there. So again, when I look at last year's South Carolina team and compare it to this year's South Carolina team, everything tells me South Carolina is going to be a better team. And then I look at the schedule. And let's go ahead and just put the schedule up on the screen now, and you'll start to see, I think, kind of what I'm talking about here. Now, they start off with a cupcake, but before I even get into predicting the wins and losses here, their first 2 SEC games of the season are on the road at Arkansas, a top 15 team, and at home against Georgia, a top 3 team, defending national champion. I can't find an SEC team that starts out with 2 tougher conference games than what South Carolina has. On the road at Arkansas and then hosting the defending champ, Georgia. And then they play 2 more non-con games, and then right before their bye week, they have to go on the road to Kentucky. Kentucky and Arkansas, to me, are very similar teams. They're both top 15-ish type teams, right? I could see Kentucky and Arkansas both winning anywhere from 8 to 10 games this year, depending on how it goes. I haven't done a prediction for either of those teams yet, but they seem like 8 to 10 win teams to me. These are really good teams. You have to play them both on the road. Now, if South Carolina could catch one or both of those teams at home, Kentucky or Arkansas, I think you'd be a lot more confident in South Carolina's ability to win one or both of those games. But the fact that they're both on the road, they're both in the first half of the season, and you also host Georgia, it's going to be a tough start to the season, I think, for South Carolina, and it doesn't get a lot easier. In the back end. But let's just start looking at some of these. We'll start picking some of these games here. Obviously, I think South Carolina is going to beat Georgia State. Now, I think South Carolina needs to prepare for Georgia State. I don't think they can just overlook them and spend all offseason focused on Arkansas. We saw a team do that a couple of years ago, and Georgia State showed up and slapped Tennessee's little bottom blue and beat them in Knoxville. If you're South Carolina, you don't want a repeat of that. And the thing is about Georgia State, they're not going to be intimidated to go into Williams-Brice Stadium when just a couple of seasons ago they went into Neyland and beat Tennessee. They're not going to be intimidated. Now, South Carolina's a better team. South Carolina should win that game, and I think South Carolina will win that game. But this isn't, everybody likes to use the word cupcake and things like that, and I agree, Georgia State's not a good or great team. I agree. But South Carolina's just not in a position where really they can afford to overlook anybody, in my opinion. But they'll get the win there, 1-0. And then you got that Week 2 matchup on the road against Sam Pittman and Arkansas. KJ Jefferson is back. He's going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC. They get some key parts back on defense. They lose their best wide receiver, but then they bring in a clone of him in Jaden Hazelwood from Oklahoma. So I don't think there's going to be much of a drop-off offensively for Arkansas, and the defense might even be a little bit better. Like I said, if this was in Williams-Brice Stadium in Columbia, it would be a lot easier for me to try to find a reason to pick South Carolina to win. Unfortunately, with it being on the road, I just can't do it. I've got to give this one to Arkansas. South Carolina's 1-1. Then you have the Georgia game. You do get them at home, and I will admit, Georgia has taken some good teams into Columbia over the years and come out with losses. But that was a long, long time ago. I think South Carolina is something like 1-5 or 1-6 against Georgia in the last 6 or 7 years. The only win coming actually in Athens a few seasons ago when South Carolina upset a top 5 Georgia team at home for Georgia in Athens there. Other than that, if you look at the games between Georgia and South Carolina, they haven't been close. Georgia's been winning these games by an average of about 24 points since Kirby Smart got to Athens in 2016. I just think this is too much to ask for a South Carolina team. I think Georgia gets the win on the road, and South Carolina goes ahead and falls to 1-2. Charlotte and then South Carolina State after that. I think you're going to beat both of those teams. I would be more concerned about Georgia State than I was Charlotte or South Carolina State. But I don't think Carolina will lose any of them. And so after your first 5 games, I've got South Carolina sitting at 2-3. And it just doesn't get any easier. You've got to go on the road and play Kentucky. And again, this game, I think maybe even more than the Arkansas game, if this game was in Columbia, I probably would pick South Carolina to win. But it's not. You have to travel, and I think Kentucky, if Kentucky beats Florida early in the year, I think they play week 3, I believe. If Kentucky beats Florida, it's possible they're undefeated still at this point in the season, Kentucky, and I just don't think South Carolina can go up to Kentucky and get the win. I've got you at 3-3 now, heading into your bye week. You come out of your bye week and you play Texas A&M, and I talked a little bit about this game at the start of the video here. I know South Carolina's never beat Texas A&M since Texas A&M joined the SEC, and they play every single year. So going back to whatever it was, 2012, 2013, South Carolina and Texas A&M have played every single year. Texas A&M has beaten South Carolina every single year. It doesn't matter, in Columbia, in College Station. This one happens to be in Columbia. I looked for a reason to pick South Carolina to win this game. When I first saw that this was coming off of a bye week, I said, well, hey, that's a good advantage for South Carolina. Let me look into this some. I might be able to roll the dice here and say that this is a game Carolina wins that they're not supposed to win. But Texas A&M is off the week before that, too. The weekend that South Carolina is playing at Kentucky, Texas A&M is playing at Alabama. So they're probably going to lose that game. I think you're going to lose to Kentucky. So you both lose a game, then go into a bye week, and then you have this Texas A&M versus South Carolina game. I think Texas A&M gets it done. I do not think Texas A&M is going to lose 4 games this year like the running joke is. Texas A&M has lost 4 games every single year they've been in the SEC, except for the 1 year with Johnny Manziel and the COVID year. So basically from 2013 till now, Texas A&M has lost 4 games every single year except the COVID year. I don't think they're going to lose 4 games this year. I think Jimbo's too good of a coach, and I think they're too talented. And I think Texas A&M gets the win on the road in Williams-Brice Stadium. South Carolina falls to 3-4. But you have a couple of get-back games here, one at home against Mizzou and one on the road at Vandy. I think you win both of those games. I think Vandy is probably the worst Power 5 team in America. And I think Mizzou, if Mizzou could have got JT Daniels, maybe they would. That probably would have been worth another couple of wins for them. And this might have been one of those games where maybe Missouri would have had a chance. I don't see Missouri beating South Carolina, especially with it being in Columbia, South Carolina. This, of course, is the Battle of the Columbias, right? Missouri plays in Columbia, Missouri. South Carolina plays in Columbia, South Carolina. You get them at home. I think you get the win over Mizzou, and obviously on the road at Vandy. Now, this was a weird game last year. You look at South Carolina had a weird year last year. Beat North Carolina in the bowl game, beat Florida. But then didn't they lose to Mizzou last year? And then Vandy, you were losing to Mizzou pretty much, or losing to Vandy pretty much the whole game. You came back at the end, beat them by 1 point. Just crazy year for South Carolina. I don't think you struggle this year with Vandy. I think you take care of business, even though it's on the road. There's not a worse home field advantage in the SEC than Vanderbilt. South Carolina probably have just as many, if not more, fans at that game than Vandy will. I think you win that one. You're on a 2-game winning streak. That's the good news. Bad news is, look at these last 3 games. At Florida, home against Tennessee, and at Clemson. It's completely within reason to think that South Carolina could lose all 3 of these games. I think Tennessee is better than South Carolina. I definitely think Clemson is better than South Carolina. South Carolina hasn't even scored a touchdown on Clemson since 2019, I believe. Clemson's just completely owned them. I think Tennessee and South Carolina, both new coaches last year, both reason to be excited headed into this year. I just think Tennessee's a little bit further along, particularly offensively, with a returning quarterback in Hendon Hooker than South Carolina is, even though, Spencer Rattler is what he is. But I would lean Tennessee in that one. I can't see. I just can't see you beating Clemson or Tennessee. I know you get Tennessee at home, and look, nobody loves laughing at Tennessee more than I do. If you somehow beat Tennessee here, I mean, the internet would break, and YouTube would definitely break. Oh, that's not right. How did I have you? I don't know why I had you. That's not a win against Clemson. Sorry, I put the wrong color up there against Clemson. I apologize. I've got you losing to Tennessee and Clemson. That's the bad news. The good news is, guess what? I've got you beating Florida for the second year in a row. Yeah, I think you get a win on the road at Florida. I think Beamer and Spencer Rattler are good enough to pull off a win that most people think South Carolina, to win a game most people think South Carolina's not going to win. I think that game is Florida. I think South Carolina will get this win at the end of the year. A 3-game winning streak there with Mizzou, Vandy, and Florida. Unfortunately, I do think you lose the last two. Like I said, I had the wrong color up there for Clemson, so I apologize for that. But I do have you dropping that Clemson game. Now, if you've been watching some of the live shows over the last couple of weeks, then you already know this. But in the last week, I actually have made a couple of bets on South Carolina's season. Now, the Vegas win total for South Carolina this year is 6.5. In other words, if you want to bet in Vegas or at a sports book on how many games you think South Carolina is going to win in the regular season, this is just the 12-game regular season, you either can bet over 6.5, which would be 7 or more, or under 6.5, which would be 6 or less. I made 2 different bets with 2 different people. The first bet I placed was that South Carolina would win 6 or less games. Obviously, I've got them at 6-6 here. The second bet that I made, there was somebody in the comment section running around saying that South Carolina was going to go 8-4, which I think is insane. I could see them going 7-5. I'll be honest. If Arkansas or Kentucky slips up in the first half of the season and South Carolina is able to get a win at either Arkansas or Kentucky, and then everything else plays out like I have it, then South Carolina could finish 7-5. I would be absolutely shocked if they finished 8-4 with this schedule, though. And again, it's not hate for South Carolina or the fact that I think they're not any good. Like I've said a bunch of times, I think they're better than they were last year. But I've got them at 6-6. Like I said, I had the wrong color for Clemson, so I just took it off the screen. But I've got them losing to Clemson. So South Carolina wins in 2022. Georgia State, Charlotte, South Carolina State, Missouri, Vandy, and Florida, 6 wins. The losses for South Carolina in 2022, at Arkansas, home against Georgia, at Kentucky, home against Texas A&M, home against Tennessee, and on the road at Clemson, 6 losses. I've got the South Carolina Gamecocks going 6-6 in 2022. Same record as last year, but I think they're a better team. In fact, I know they're a better team than last year. This schedule is just brutal. Road games at Arky and Kentucky in the first half of the year, sandwiched around a home game with Georgia. And then you look at the back half of the schedule there. Texas A&M coming out of the bye week, very difficult game. And then the last 3 games are all games South Carolina could lose: at Florida, home against Tennessee, and at Clemson. I've got them going 1-2 there with a win against Florida, losing to Tennessee. And Clemson finishing up at 6-6 with the potential to match last year's win total of 7, depending on what bowl matchup South Carolina gets. Again, shout out to everybody over on the Patreon page for all the help and support that you give me on this channel. If you would like to join the Patreon page, just click the link in the description of this video. It'll take you over there. You can look around. You'll see the post I made about these prediction videos. Just leave a comment on what team it is you want me to do, and I will make sure and get it done. I appreciate everybody tuning in. Have a good morning.